Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that drifts between power and passion, between violence and desire. It is a story of Pablo Escobar, the drug lord who ruled Colombia not only with bullets and bribes, but also with a private world of lovers, secrets, and scandal. His mistresses were as much a part of his empire as his money and his mansions. Some whispered of forbidden parties. Others told stories of stolen youth, luxury beyond imagination, and betrayals that could cost a life. This is not just a tale of crime, but of intimacy twisted by power. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Now, let's settle in. Picture the night falling softly over the hills of... The air is warm, perfumed by tropical flowers that climb the walls of grand haciendas. In the distance, city lights flicker like restless stars. While inside the estates of Escobar, silence is broken only by the rustle of silk sheets and the faint splash of fountains. It was here, in these luxurious mansions, that Escobar's mistresses lived their strange and scandalous lives. Half queens, half prisoners. Pablo Escobar was not just a man of business. He was a man of appetites. His empire of cocaine made him one of the richest men in the world. With that wealth came an insatiable hunger, not only for power, but for women. To the outside world, he was married. To Victoria Haino, quiet and devoted wife who married him at the age of 15. Yet behind the locked gates of his properties, Escobar built a world filled with mistresses, lovers, and fleeting affairs. Imagine him as he appeared in the 1980s. Thick mustache. Eyes that burned with intensity, a presence that could silence a room. To his enemies, he was ruthless. To his allies, he was generous. To his mistresses, he was both protector and captor. He offered diamonds, cars, private apartments, but in return, he demanded loyalty, secrecy, and surrender. One of the most infamous of his mistresses was Virginia Vallejo, a glamorous television anchor. She was elegant, confident, and unafraid of scandal. To many, she represented the glamour that Escobar craved. Not just wealth, but acceptance into the high society of Colombia. Their relationship was passionate, dangerous, and deeply political. Virginia would later write a memoir, revealing details of her time as Escobar's mistress, and describing how she was swept into a world where violence and romance were inseparably intertwined. But Virginia was not the only one. Escobar was said to keep entire mansions for his affairs. He constructed secret bedrooms, hidden passages, and private gardens where he entertained young women. Often underage, lured by gifts and promises, the mistresses of Pablo Escobar lived in an alternate reality, shielded from the outside world, yet haunted by the constant fear of betrayal, police raids, or rival assassins. Let's pause and imagine one of those nights. The hacienda. Escobar's grand estate stretched across thousands of acres. By day, it was a playground of excess, complete with a private zoo, swimming pools, and an airstrip for smuggling planes. By night, it transformed into a more secretive world. Behind the brightly lit facades, whispers traveled through long hallways. A young mistress might wait in a perfumed room, silk curtains swaying in the breeze, the sound of distant exotic animals echoing through the night. She would hear Escobar's footsteps approach, steady, commanding, and know that for tonight she belonged to the most feared man in Colombia. And yet, despite his power, Escobar was vulnerable in love. His mistresses often became liabilities. They knew too much. They saw the private side of the man who pretended to be a family man in public. They witnessed his cruelties, but also his tenderness. Some adored him, some feared him, some betrayed him. There were stories of how Escobar would lavish gifts upon his lovers: diamond necklaces, European vacations, designer dresses. He wanted them to sparkle like trophies, proof of his reach and power. But the price of disobedience was steep. One rumor tells of a mistress who leaked details of his movements to enemies. She disappeared, never seen again. Another was said to have been beaten when she spoke to journalists. Escobar's love was not gentle. It was possessive, consuming, dangerous. Still, women continued to be drawn to him. To understand why, we must remember the Colombia of that era. Escobar was more than a drug lord. He was a Robin Hood figure to many. Built houses for the poor, gave away money in slums, and constructed football fields for children. For some women, being chosen by Escobar was a mark of prestige, almost like being invited into royalty. Dark royalty, steeped in blood and scandal. Picture a night when Escobar threw a private party. Music echoed across the hacienda. Candles lit the gardens, and tables overflowed with food and champagne. Soldiers guarded the gates, but inside, the mood was intoxicating. Mistresses laughed softly, their dresses shimmering under the lights. Escobar moved among them like a king surveying his court. To some, he whispered promises of a future. To others, he offered only one night of passion. And all the while, the shadow of danger lingered. For outside those walls, enemies plotted, the government hunted, and rival cartels sharpened their knives. The story of Pablo Escobar's Mistresses is not just about romance. It is about how power corrupts intimacy, how desire becomes tangled with fear. These women were not simply lovers, they were symbols of Escobar's ego, possessions to be displayed, yet also confidants who carried his secrets. Their lives became entangled with his empire of cocaine, violence, and politics. And so, as we sink deeper into this story tonight, we will wander through the mansions of Escobar, meet his most notorious mistresses, and uncover the scandals that history tried to bury. From the elegance of Virginia Vallejo to the forgotten whispers of young girls hidden away in secret rooms, every tale reveals another layer of Escobar's hunger for love, for control, for immortality. Close your eyes now and imagine the warm night of once again. Hear the soft rustle of palm trees. Feel the stillness of a world locked behind high walls. Inside, the mistresses of Pablo Escobar waited. Some in fear, some in desire, all inextricably bound to a man whose shadow loomed larger than life. This is only the beginning. Virginia Vallejo was unlike the others, where most of Escobar's mistresses came from obscurity, plucked from neighborhoods and schools. Virginia was already a star. She was one of Colombia's most beloved television presenters, a glamorous woman with striking features, always dressed in elegance. To the public, she was confident, witty, untouchable. But to Pablo Escobar, she was a prize unlike any other. Proof that his power had reached into the very heart of Colombian high society. Their story began in the early 1980s. Imagine a smoky nightclub filled with wealthy businessmen, politicians, and rising stars. Music pulsed, laughter echoed, and in the corner sat Escobar, not yet the world's most wanted man, but already feared and respected. His eyes locked on Virginia, and she noticed him too. The intensity, confidence, the strange combination of menace and charm. That night, whispers began. Soon they would be inseparable. Virginia would later write in her memoir that Escobar pursued her with relentless energy. He sent flowers so large they filled an entire room. He offered her jewels, cars, vacations. But more than gifts, he offered something intoxicating. The feeling of being desired by the most powerful man in Colombia. Picture the scene. A sleek car waiting outside the television studio where Virginia filmed her shows. Escobar's men stood watch, while inside the car, a note from Pablo awaited. Dinner tonight. Just us. She knew the risks. She knew the scandal it could cause if discovered, yet curiosity, and perhaps vanity, pulled her toward him. Soon she found herself swept into Escobar's private world. At the hacienda, he hosted her like royalty. He guided her through his private zoo, showing off elephants, giraffes, and rare birds. He dined with her under the stars, servants bringing silver platters of food, while music floated across the gardens. For a moment, Virginia felt as though she had stepped into a fairy tale. Except this fairy tale was written in blood and cocaine. Escobar treated Virginia differently than his other mistresses. With her, he wanted to be seen. He wanted to flaunt her beauty, her status, her sophistication. She became his companion at political meetings, his guest at secret gatherings of power. In public, whispers grew louder. The glamorous TV anchor and the rising drug lord. But what seemed glamorous on the surface was darker beneath. Escobar's empire was built on violence, and Virginia could not ignore the shadows that followed him. She saw the weapons, the bodyguards, the fear in the eyes of those who crossed his path. She heard the whispered threats, the confessions of crimes committed without remorse. Escobar confided in her, trusting her with details of his empire. And while she was flattered, she was also trapped. The deeper she went, the harder it was to escape. Imagine her sitting in a grand bedroom at the hacienda. Sheets are silk, the air heavy with perfume, but outside, she hears the crack of gunfire in the distance. Escobar enters, his smile wide, his presence filling the room. To him, this is love. A woman adored, a man powerful enough to protect her. But to Virginia, it is a prison gilded with diamonds. She would later write about Escobar's contradictions. He could be tender, whispering endearments, stroking her hair. Then, in the next breath, he would describe a rival's assassination as casually as if he were ordering dinner. His love was not gentle. It was consuming. He wanted her loyalty, her silence, her obedience. And in return, he gave her the world, but only the world as he owned it. Their affair lasted several years, and during that time, Virginia became one of the most notorious women in Colombia. Some envied her, others despised her. Many whispered that she was as corrupt as Escobar himself, seduced not only by his wealth, but by the thrill of danger. She attended parties where politicians mingled with drug lords, where bribes flowed as freely as champagne. She saw firsthand how Escobar blurred the line between crime and politics, how he bribed judges, funded campaigns, and bent the country to his will. But Virginia was not blind. She knew that every gift, every kiss, came with a cost. She saw how Escobar's violence spread like a plague, leaving widows and orphans in its wake. She felt the weight of his empire pressing against her conscience. Yet still, she stayed, drawn back again and again by the magnetism of his presence. There is a story of one night when Escobar and Virginia attended a secret gathering of politicians. Escobar arrived late, dressed not as a gangster, but in an elegant suit, with Virginia at his side. The room fell silent. Here was a man officially despised, yet privately courted. With Virginia on his arm, Escobar looked not like a criminal, but like a king with his queen. And Virginia, despite herself, felt the thrill of power. But power is a dangerous drug. As the 1980s wore on, Escobar's war with the government escalated, bombings shook, assassinations tore through the streets. The world grew darker, bloodier. Virginia, once shielded by Escobar's love, now found herself endangered by it. Enemies whispered her name. Journalists speculated about her role, and within her heart, fear began to grow. Imagine the contrast. The glamorous anchor, sitting before cameras by day, her smile radiant, her voice calm. And by night, the mistress of a drug lord lying awake in silk sheets, listening to the echoes of violence outside. The double life became unbearable. Eventually, Virginia broke. The relationship unraveled, poisoned by fear, jealousy, and Escobar's increasing paranoia. She fled Colombia, carrying with her not only memories but secrets. Years later, she would testify against Escobar's associates, revealing details of his empire. Her memoir, Loving Pablo, Hating Escobar, painted their affair in vivid detail, a portrait of love twisted by corruption. Virginia Vallejo's story reminds us that Escobar's mistresses were more than lovers. They were witnesses. They saw the private man behind the legend, the contradictions of a king who built his throne on blood. Some adored him, some betrayed him, some perished because of him. But Virginia lived to tell the tale, her voice carrying the scandal into history. As we drift deeper into this story tonight, let us remember her, the glamorous woman who danced with danger, who loved and hated the same man, who lived a life caught between the spotlight and the shadows. Close your eyes now and picture her in those days. The lights of glittering outside the window, the phone ringing with Escobar's voice on the other end. The thrill, the fear, the longing. This was Virginia Vallejo, Escobar's mistress, his confidant, his scandal, and yet she was only one of many, because behind Virginia's elegance there were other women, younger, poorer, often hidden away. Their stories were darker still. Virginia Vallejo may have been the most visible, the most glamorous, but she was not alone. Behind the polished surface of Escobar's life, behind the zoo animals and marble fountains of Hacienda, there were other women, dozens of them, vulnerable and often forgotten by history. Escobar had an insatiable appetite for women. It was not enough to have a wife, Maria Victoria Haynau, who stood by his side since she was just 15 years old. It was not enough to have Virginia, the glamorous star. No, Pablo Escobar wanted more. He wanted girls who reminded him of innocence he could corrupt, women who could be bent to his will, lovers who existed solely within the private chambers of his empire. Whispers spread across in the 1980s. Escobar's men scoured beauty pageants, small towns, even schools, searching for fresh faces to please the... A young girl walking home might find herself noticed by one of his bodyguards. An invitation would follow, a party at the hacienda, a night in luxury. For some, it was dazzling. A sudden escape from poverty into a world of pools, champagne, and designer clothes. But for many, it was a trap. Once inside Escobar's circle, there was no way out. Imagine the hacienda on a hot summer evening. The air heavy with the scent of orchids, music playing softly, and Escobar's men patrolling the grounds. Inside, girls barely into their teens sat nervously on velvet couches, sipping sodas while waiting for the man they had been told was a king, They wore new dresses bought just for them, their hair styled, their lips painted. To outsiders, it might have looked like a glamorous party. But behind the glitter, there was unease. The quiet understanding that their lives were no longer their own. Escobar enjoyed surrounding himself with beauty. It was part of his power. To walk into a room and have young women gaze at him with awe, whether genuine or forced, fed his ego like nothing else. He called them his ninas, his little girls. And though he showered them with gifts, cars, apartments, jewelry, the gifts were chains. To accept them was to accept him. To refuse was unthinkable. There is a story told in hushed tones of how Escobar once visited a school under the pretense of philanthropy. He handed out money, promised scholarships, spoke of building a better future. But behind closed doors, his eyes searched the crowd for faces he found appealing. Weeks later, some of those girls disappeared from their neighborhoods, tearing in the secret houses, of hidden away as playthings for the adult. For Escobar, mistresses were not simply lovers, they were symbols of his dominance. Just as he owned cities, politicians, and armies, he owned women. Each one was a reminder that there was no limit to what his power could buy. But not every mistress stayed silent. Some became liabilities. In the wives of men killed by Escobar whispered that their daughters had been taken. Families wept in silence, unable to accuse the most dangerous man in Colombia. The newspapers hinted at the scandals but rarely printed names. To accuse Escobar openly was to invite death. Even Virginia Vallejo, years later, admitted that she was not alone in his arms. She knew of the others. She saw the younger girls arrive, watched them vanish into his chambers. And though she tried to convince herself she was different, deep down she knew. No woman ever held all of Escobar's heart. Picture a secret apartment. In the curtains drawn, the furniture modest but new, a bodyguard standing watch at the door. Inside, a young mistress waits, her phone ready to ring at any moment. She cannot leave. She cannot see friends. She exists only for the visits of her life suspended between fear and privilege. For some, this went on for years. For others, only months, until Escobar grew bored and moved on. What happened to these women when Escobar tired of them? Some were discarded, left with apartments and cars, but forever tainted by their connection to him. Others vanished into the chaos of the cartel wars, silenced before they could speak. A few, like Virginia, survived to tell their stories, but most remained nameless, their lives swallowed by the legend of the man who once claimed them. And yet, Escobar was not careless. He knew that women could become his downfall. He surrounded them with bodyguards, monitored their families, ensured their loyalty through fear and wealth. He was possessive, jealous, and violent when betrayed. A mistress who talked too much could vanish overnight, her disappearance explained away as an accident, her name barely remembered. Still, even in this darkness, there were moments of twisted tenderness. Escobar was known to write love letters, to send poems written in his own hand. To one mistress, he compared her beauty to the mountains of Antioquia, strong and eternal. To another, he promised eternal love, even as he courted 5 more. These contradictions defined him. A man capable of affection, but also of cruelty without hesitation. The people knew of these mistresses. They whispered their names in markets, speculated on their identities. Taxi drivers claimed to have driven them to hidden apartments. Shopkeepers bragged of selling them clothes. and though everyone knew the truth, few dared speak it aloud. Escobar's mistresses were both envied and pitied. Envied for their wealth, pitied for their captivity. One of the most infamous rumors was of Escobar's obsession with beauty queens. Pageants were common in Colombia, from small-town fairs to national competitions. Escobar's men often scouted these events, approaching contestants with promises of wealth and fame. Some girls dreamed of crowns and television appearances, only to find themselves in the arms of the drug lord. In time, people joked bitterly that the surest way to win a pageant was to catch the eye of Escobar. Yet, within these stories lies a deeper truth. Escobar's mistresses were not only symbols of his desire, but casualties of his empire. They remind us of how power corrupts intimacy, how love can be twisted into possession, how beauty can become a curse when caught in the orbit of violence. As you imagine these scenes tonight, let your mind drift slowly through them. Picture the hacienda, its lights glowing in the distance. Picture the secret apartments, silent and guarded. Picture the young girls, once full of dreams, now bound to a man whose love was more dangerous than hate. These are the hidden mistresses of Pablo Escobar. Their names may be forgotten, but their shadows linger in every story told of him. And as we move forward, we will see how these hidden affairs collided with his public life, how his marriage, his children, and his empire were all shaped by the women he could never let go. Long before the world knew him as the king of cocaine, Pablo Escobar was just a poor boy from Rio Negro. And long before the whispers of mistresses, there was only one woman by his side, Maria Victoria Henao. She was just a girl when she met him, 15 years old, with wide eyes and soft features. Pablo was 24, already involved in shady dealings, already dreaming of greatness. Against her family's protests, Maria Victoria fell in love with him. She said he made her feel like a queen, like she was chosen. By 16, she was his wife. By 17, she was the mother of his first child. To the public, Maria Victoria was the quiet shadow behind the most dangerous man in Colombia. She rarely spoke, rarely appeared in photographs. But behind closed doors, she lived a life of contradictions. Luxury wrapped in betrayal, wealth laced with grief. Imagine the house in the early years of their marriage. Small, modest, the air filled with laughter as young Maria cooked meals and cared for their baby. Pablo, ambitious and restless, came home late, his pockets full of money from schemes that Maria did not dare question. At first, she believed he was only a hustler, a man who would one day provide a better life. She had no idea of the empire he would build, but as the 1980s unfolded, the truth became impossible to ignore. The money multiplied. The cars became faster, the houses larger, the security tighter. And with the rise of Escobar's power came the rise of his infidelity. Maria Victoria was forced to watch as her husband flaunted mistresses, as his name was whispered alongside beauty queens, actresses, and schoolgirls. Still, she endured. Those who knew her described her as deeply religious, devoted to her children, and utterly loyal. She told herself she stayed for the family, for the safety of their son and daughter. She told herself she stayed because leaving Pablo was unthinkable, not only for the danger it posed, but because her entire world had been built around him. There is a story of Maria Victoria walking through a market with her children, bodyguards trailing behind. As she passed stalls of fruit and flowers, women whispered behind her back, "There goes Escobar's wife." Some pitied her. imagining her humiliation. Others envied her, wishing they had her wealth. Maria Victoria kept her head down, clutching her children's hands, pretending not to hear. She knew about the mistresses. How could she not? The newspapers hinted at Virginia Vallejo. Neighbors whispered about the secret apartments. Rumors of young girls reached even her ears. Yet she remained silent, keeping her pain locked deep inside. In private, there were arguments, shouted words behind thick walls. Tears shed in quiet rooms. She accused him of betrayal. He brushed it aside. He promised her loyalty, then broke it again. But she stayed. Always she stayed. Why? Some say it was fear. To leave Pablo Escobar was to invite his wrath. Others say it was love. A love born in childhood, unshakable even under the weight of his sins. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps Maria Victoria believed she could never exist without him, just as he believed no woman could ever leave him. Imagine her sitting alone in their vast hacienda, the children asleep in their beds. Outside, the guards patrol with rifles. Inside, silence presses heavy on the walls. She knows where he is, with Virginia or with another girl. She knows he will return smelling of perfume not her own. And yet, she waits. Because that is what wives do. That is what she has become. Still, there were moments of tenderness. Escobar, for all his cruelty, was not indifferent to his family. He adored his children, playing with them for hours, showering them with gifts. He built them playgrounds, brought them animals from around the world, told them stories at bedtime. In those moments, Maria Victoria glimpsed the man she married, the boy from Riangro who had once promised her the world. But even his love for family was dangerous. When the government hunted him, Maria, Victoria, and the children became fugitives, running from safe house to safe house, always in fear of bombs, bullets, or betrayal. They lived in hiding, trapped by his choices, forced to carry the burden of his empire. Still, the mistresses followed. For Maria Victoria, this was the cruelest wound. It's not the poverty she had endured in the beginning, not the violence that surrounded them, no, but the endless stream of women who shared her husband's bed. Each one a reminder that she was not enough, that her loyalty was rewarded with humiliation, and yet she never left him. Even after his death in 1993, Maria Victoria remained silent for years, refusing to speak ill of him. Only decades later did she publish a memoir revealing the truth of her pain. She wrote of his affairs, his betrayals, his lies, but she also wrote of her love, her devotion, her belief that somewhere beneath the layers of crime and corruption, Pablo Escobar still loved her too. Her story is not glamorous. It is not scandalous in the way of Virginia Vallejo's memoirs or the whispered rumors of beauty queens. It is quieter, sadder, more human. She was the wife who endured, the woman who raised his children, buried his body, and lived to tell the tale. As you let your thoughts drift tonight, picture her not as the wife of a drug lord, but as a woman sitting alone at a window. Outside, the city glitters with lights. Inside, she waits for a husband who will never truly be hers. She whispers a prayer, clutches a rosary, and tells herself that tomorrow will be better. But deep down, she knows tomorrow will be the same. Maria Victoria's story is a reminder that behind every powerful man, there is often a woman unseen, carrying the weight of his choices. She was loyal, she was patient, she was silent. In her silence lies one of the most heartbreaking truths of Escobar's world, that even in his own home, love was poisoned by betrayal. And still, outside those walls, other mistresses waited, Younger, bolder, more scandalous. The empire of desire was never satisfied. By the mid-1980s, Pablo Escobar was no longer just a drug trafficker. He was a myth, a monster, and to many in Colombia, an untouchable king. His money poured into politics, football clubs, and entire neighborhoods. He became a godlike figure for the poor, and yet, in the private halls of nightclubs and banquet rooms, his true kingdom was not of the people, but of women. For Escobar, women were not only companions, they were trophies. And the most glittering trophies of all were the beauty queens of Colombia. Colombia has always worshipped its beauty pageants. The annual Miss Colombia contest, held in Cartagena, was more than just a show. It was a national event, with all eyes fixed on the glittering crowns and silk gowns. For the cartels, these pageants became a hunting ground. Behind the stage lights and camera flashes, whispered deals were struck, and powerful men claimed the young women as their spoils. Escobar was no exception. He loved the allure of beauty queens, elegant, refined, desired by the nation. To conquer one was to prove his power not only in business, but in the secret, scandalous world of desire. Rumors spread that he used his fortune to sponsor contestants, quietly paying for their gowns, their makeup, their travel in exchange for loyalty. Lavish after-parties, where champagne flowed and music pulsed through the night, he selected those who caught his eye. One story tells of Escobar arranging a private meeting with a regional pageant winner. She was barely 18, dressed in a shimmering gown, her crown still perched delicately on her head. He whisked her away in a convoy of armored cars, promising her gifts, jewels, a life of comfort. She entered his world dazzled by the wealth, but soon trapped in a cage of gold. To outsiders, these women lived like queens, wore designer dresses, draped themselves in diamonds, traveled in private jets, but beneath the surface, they were pawns. For each woman, there was another waiting in the wings. When their beauty faded, when Escobar's attention drifted, they were discarded. But some beauty queens lingered longer than others. One was connected not only by desire, but by scandal. Her name was said in hushed tones, a title holder who became deeply entangled with the cartel. She appeared at Escobar's parties, at his estates, at gatherings where men in silk suits drank whiskey while discussing shipments of cocaine. Her presence was a symbol. Escobar could claim not just wealth and power, but also the nation's most coveted women. The pageant world itself became tainted by cartel influence. Judges were bribed. Winners were rumored to be chosen not for their grace, but for their connections to powerful men. Behind the glittering stage, whispers of corruption grew louder. Families warned their daughters, "Be careful who notices you." Crown could lead not only to fame, but to a gilded prison. Imagine the scene at Hacienda Escobar's sprawling estate. Hundreds of guests gather under the Colombian sun. Exotic animals roam the fields, giraffes, zebras, elephants brought from Africa. In the midst of it all, a beauty queen stands by his side. Her smile is radiant, but her eyes betray unease. Around her, men with rifles patrol the grounds. She knows she is a guest, but also a possession. Escobar flaunted these women not only for pleasure, but for dominance. To take a beauty queen was to humiliate the country's elite. Politicians and businessmen who dreamed of courting these women instead watched as Escobar claimed them one by one. It was his way of saying, "I am untouchable. I own what you only dream of." But these scandals left scars. Some beauty queens vanished into obscurity, their names erased from public memory. Others survived, their later lives marked by whispers of their cartel connections. A few dared to speak decades later, telling of the fear, the pressure, the reality hidden behind their crowns. The most shocking revelations came not from Escobar himself, but from the women who later confessed. What it was like to be caught in his web. One recalled his charm, the way he could shift from ruthless to tender in seconds. Another spoke of the danger, the constant fear that refusing him would mean punishment not only for her, but for her family. It was never simply about love. It was about survival. To fall into Escobar's world as a beauty queen was to live in constant contradiction. One night, you were sipping champagne beside a swimming pool, as fireworks lit the sky. The next, you were hiding in a safe house, listening to the echo of gunfire in the streets. At any moment, your life could collapse with his. This was the true scandal, that the crowns and gowns, meant to symbolize innocence and national pride, became weapons in the hands of a man who ruled through fear and desire. And yet these stories fascinated the Colombian public. Even today, decades after Escobar's death, the rumors still circulate. Which queens were his mistresses? Which contests were bought with his money? Which women carried his secrets in silence? For the people, it became part of the legend. The image of Escobar surrounded not only by money and guns, but by the most beautiful women in the country. For his enemies, it was yet another humiliation. Another reminder that even the nation's daughters were not beyond his reach. And as the beauty queens faded, younger girls appeared. Escobar's hunger did not diminish, it grew. The scandals of the pageants were only the beginning. Behind closed doors, darker obsessions took root. With schoolgirls, with virgins, with women far too young to resist the power of a man who controlled billions. But that is another part of the story. Pablo Escobar's empire was built on blood, money, and cocaine. But within the walls of his private mansions, it was also built on desire. And perhaps the darkest, most disturbing part of that desire was his obsession with very young girls. As his wealth and power grew, Escobar's appetite became more twisted. He no longer wanted only beauty queens or glamorous women in diamonds. He wanted innocence. He wanted what should have been untouchable. And because he was Escobar, nothing was out of reach. Rumors began to circulate in his neighborhoods. Whispers that Escobar sent his men into schools, not for weapons, but for women. Teachers and parents murmured about black cars that lingered near the gates. Girls as young as 14, 15 were said to have been approached. Promises of money, gifts, protection, and above all, a chance to be close to the most powerful man in Colombia. Some parents were terrified. Others, poor and desperate, allowed it. After all, who could refuse Escobar? To say no was dangerous. To say yes meant survival, at least for the family. One of the most shocking claims came from Virginia Vallejo, Escobar's famous mistress and television anchor. She revealed in her memoirs that Pablo had an obsession with virgins. He believed that sleeping with them would cleanse him, give him a kind of purity, even as he drowned himself in corruption. Vallejo described scenes where Escobar kept lists of schoolgirls, brought to his haciendas like prizes, like offerings to a king. Imagine the scene. A convoy of trucks rolls up to hacienda. The gates open. The girls step inside nervously, their school uniforms replaced with borrowed dresses. They see giraffes and elephants, fountains and swimming pools, the grand palace of Colombia's most feared man. Music plays softly in the distance. The air smells of rich perfumes and expensive cigars. And somewhere inside the mansion, Escobar waits, smiling, ready to choose. For the girls, it was overwhelming. Some were flattered, even seduced by the idea of wealth. Others were terrified, but had no choice. To resist was unthinkable. To please him was survival. And what Escobar demanded, Escobar received. These encounters became a dark routine. He was said to pay families generous sums afterward, as if to buy their silence. Some mothers, desperate for food and safety, even encouraged their daughters. Others wept quietly in secret, knowing they had no power against the man who owned. The scandal was immense, though few dared to speak of it. Within the city, it was an open secret. Journalists whispered, but never wrote. Teachers noticed girls vanishing from classes, then returning with new clothes, jewelry, even cars. No one dared to challenge it. Escobar's obsession with schoolgirls revealed something more terrifying than his violence. Revealed his belief that he could take anything, even innocence, and claim it as his own. To him, these girls were not human beings, but symbols of power. By taking them, he showed the world that not even the sacred bond of youth and family could escape his reach. But this scandal also carried danger. Escobar's enemies watched closely, ready to exploit any weakness. Politicians whispered of his perversions. Rivals spread stories in the underworld, mocking his obsessions. For a man who built an image as a family man, a Robin Hood, the truth was darker. Behind the mask of generosity, behind the donations to the poor, lay a predator. And yet even this truth only added to his myth. Some admired him still, refusing to believe the rumors. Others hated him more fiercely, seeing him not only as a drug lord, but as a monster who defiled the nation's daughters. It is said that Escobar kept a hidden wing at Hacienda, a secret place where no cameras were allowed, no outsiders admitted. There he held his most private gatherings, not with soldiers or politicians, but with young girls, velvet curtains, dim lights, the faint sound of music playing from hidden speakers. It was a world built for seduction. A world where innocence was stripped away under the watchful eyes of men who obeyed his every command. Some of those girls never spoke of what happened. Others, years later, broke their silence, telling stories of fear, shame, and survival. They remembered his voice, soft but commanding, his promises, sweet but empty, his presence terrifying but impossible to resist. And perhaps the greatest scandal of all is how long it was allowed to continue. The police knew, the politicians knew, the press suspected, but no one stopped him, because to stop Escobar was to invite death. So the silence stretched on, and behind that silence, lives were destroyed. By the late 1980s, as Escobar's war with the government intensified, these private scandals became overshadowed by bombs and assassinations. Yet the truth remained, hidden beneath the headlines of violence. While the world spoke of car bombs, politicians, and drug shipments, the whispers of schoolgirls haunted the halls. This is the darkest chapter of his mistresses, not the glamour of beauty queens, not the elegance of actresses, but the broken innocence of children turned into trophies for a man who believed himself untouchable. And even now, decades after his death, those stories still echo. They remind us that power without limits corrupts absolutely, that when a man becomes a god in his own eyes, nothing is sacred. Not even youth, not even purity. It was not just cocaine that stained Escobar's empire. It was scandal. It was the stolen innocence of those too young to understand the weight of the world they had been pulled into. And it was a scandal that for many remains too painful to speak of even today. By day, Pablo Escobar tried to wear the mask of a devoted family man. To the world, he wanted to appear as a loving husband, a protective father, a man who adored his wife Maria Victoria and their children, Juan Pablo and Manuela. Photographs showed him smiling at birthday parties, holding his little girl in his arms. Playing soccer with his son in the gardens of Hacienda, he liked those images. He needed them. They gave him legitimacy, a public face that could soften the reality of the bombings, the blood, the bodies left in the streets of two. To the poor, he was Don Pablo, the man who gave them houses, schools, and money. To his wife, he wanted to be seen as a provider, a man of strength. But behind the polished photographs was a life thick with lies. Escobar's mistresses were everywhere, in hidden apartments, in secret rooms of his mansions, in luxury hotels across Colombia and abroad. Maria Victoria, still so young herself when she married him, learned early to look the other way. She was only 15 when Escobar, already powerful, took her as his bride. By the time she was a mother, she had already endured years of betrayal. Neighbors whispered that she knew of the affairs but chose silence because to protest would mean humiliation. Or worse, Escobar, in his arrogance, did not always bother to hide it. Sometimes he brought his mistresses to the same social gatherings where his wife was present. He would smile, introduce them as friends, charm the crowd with his jokes. But Maria Victoria knew. She always knew. Virginia Vallejo, the glamorous television anchor, was perhaps his most famous mistress. To her, Escobar offered not just money, but passion, excitement, danger. In her memoirs, she wrote of candlelit dinners, of the way Pablo watched her with hunger and pride. She described trips on private jets, secret weekends in luxury suites, gifts of emeralds and gold. And yet, when the lights dimmed and she was alone, she realized she was not unique. She was one among many. Escobar collected women as he collected cars, planes, and exotic animals. He was addicted not to love, but to possession. For Escobar, his wife and his mistresses served different purposes. Maria Victoria was stability, respectability, the mother of his children, the symbol of his family image. His mistresses were escape, indulgence, a reflection of his untamed desires. This double life created an atmosphere of tension. At Hacienda, where his family lived, there were entire wings of the mansion that his wife never entered. Rumors said that on some nights while Maria Victoria slept with their daughter beside her, Pablo would slip into another room where a mistress waited. The contradiction was staggering. To his daughter Manuela, he was the most loving father imaginable. He built her a carousel, a miniature zoo, even once burned millions of dollars in cash just to keep her warm on a cold night, while they hid from the police. To his wife, he sometimes played the role of affectionate husband, yet, in the same breath, he was betraying them both. The mistresses themselves lived in a delicate balance of fear and desire. Some were intoxicated by the wealth, furs, jewels, private trips, the feeling of being close to the most powerful man in the country. Others were terrified, knowing that Escobar's charm could turn to cruelty if he felt betrayed. There were stories of women who tried to leave him, who wanted freedom from the gilded cage. Some disappeared, others returned, shaken and silent. never daring to try again. For them, the relationship was not love, but survival. And all the while, Maria Victoria remained in the shadows. Some accounts say she prayed often, confiding in her family, trying to preserve the image of marriage. She raised her children in the middle of chaos, shielding them from the darkest truths. But she could not shield herself. She lived with the knowledge that her husband's love was shared, scattered, corrupted. This double life spilled into Escobar's dealings with the world, funded schools and hospitals, posing as a generous patron. Yet at the same time, he corrupted schoolgirls, paid off families, and kept women hidden in safe houses. The contradiction was too great to sustain, and those close to him began to see the cracks. Virginia Vallejo herself grew disillusioned. She realized that for all his attention, Pablo was never hers alone. In public, he played the doting father. In private, he slipped into darkness with women half her age. Her passion turned to bitterness, her loyalty to resentment. Eventually, she would betray him with her words, revealing his obsessions to the world. And yet Escobar seemed untouched by guilt. He lived as if the rules of morality did not apply to him. He was the law. He was the power. To him, women were rivers flowing into the sea of his empire, some calm, some stormy, all eventually consumed. But this constant pursuit of pleasure, this endless cycle of wives and mistresses, came at a cost. His enemies whispered about his weakness. His allies worried that his indulgences made him careless. His wife and children carried the weight of humiliation. Perhaps most haunting of all, his mistresses, some willingly, some by force, became symbols of how power corrupts the most intimate parts of human life. In the daylight, Escobar held his daughter on his shoulders, teaching her to ride a horse. At night, he whispered into the ear of a mistress, promising her the world. Between those two lives was a canyon of lies, one that no bridge could ever cross. It is here in this cruel contrast that the true scandal of Escobar's mistresses becomes clear. It was not only about lust or betrayal, it was about the way power allows a man to live two lives at once: the loving father and the predator, the devoted husband and the adulterer, the giver of gifts and the taker of innocence. And as the years passed, those two lives began to collide. The police hunted him. The government declared war. And while bombs exploded in the streets of while politicians fell to assassins' bullets, Escobar still found time to indulge his desires, to meet a mistress in a candlelit room, to whisper promises he could never keep. In the end, it was not only his empire of cocaine that destroyed him, it was the empire of secrets he built within the walls of his own home. As Pablo Escobar's empire expanded, so too did the number of women who orbited his world. Each mistress brought not only pleasure, but also risk. Desire, after all, is never private when a man holds power on such a scale. Every affair was a secret waiting to be revealed. Every whispered promise a potential weapon in the hands of enemies. Some of Escobar's lovers remained loyal, terrified of his wrath and seduced by his wealth. Others, however, became unpredictable. In the dangerous game of politics, crime, and lust, women who once lay in his arms sometimes carried daggers hidden in their words. Take Virginia Vallejo, the famous television anchor. For years, she was his most glamorous mistress. Escobar adored the way she lit up a room, her presence as dazzling as the diamonds he draped across her neck. She accompanied him to parties, to secret meetings, even to hideouts during the height of his war with the government. But eventually, Vallejo's disillusionment boiled into bitterness. She saw through the myth of the Robin Hood king. She realized she was not his only treasure, but just another jewel in a box already overflowing. When their passion cooled, Vallejo became dangerous. She carried memories, secrets, and intimate knowledge of Escobar's movements. In later years after his death, she would write openly of his obsessions, his appetite for virgins, his cruelty toward women, his contradictions as a father and a predator. Her words cut deeper than bullets because they stripped away the heroic mask he had worn before the poor. But she was not the only mistress to hold such power. There were others, hidden women in Cartagena and Miami. Some were actresses drawn to his money. Others were teenagers, pulled from obscurity and placed into gilded cages. Each one had the potential to betray. Each one had a story that, if told, could destroy his carefully crafted image. Escobar knew this. He lavished them with gifts, but also surrounded them with fear. His men kept watch. His mistresses knew that to speak too freely might mean disappearance. Yet even fear cannot silence every heart. Love turns to jealousy. Passion turns to anger. And anger in Escobar's world was a dangerous fire. There are whispers of mistresses who fed information to rivals. Women who passed secrets to police, who told journalists of what they had seen inside his palaces. Some of these stories are difficult to confirm, but in the violent atmosphere of even a rumor could be deadly. Imagine the tension. A young woman, once thrilled by his wealth, now trapped in a house with guards at every door. She longs for freedom. She writes letters in secret or whispers to a friend who dares to listen. And somewhere beyond the walls, Escobar's enemies are listening, eager to use her words as a weapon. For Escobar, this created a problem no money could solve. Cocaine shipments could be protected with soldiers. Politicians could be bribed. But a mistress's heart, fragile, unpredictable, could not be controlled. The paradox of his power was cruel. Same mistresses who gave him pleasure also made him vulnerable. Each affair was another thread in the web that could one day strangle him. By the late 1980s, Escobar was fighting on many fronts. The government hunted him. Rival cartels sought his head. The Americans closed in from the skies. And yet, even in the middle of this storm, he could not abandon his appetite. He kept taking lovers, kept feeding the hunger that never seemed satisfied. It was as if he believed he was invincible, not just in war, but in desire. But invincibility is a lie. One night, as the story goes, Escobar slipped away from his compound to meet a mistress in a private apartment. The city was tense, soldiers searching for him, helicopters circling overhead. Yet in the dimly lit room, he poured wine, whispered sweet words, and forgot the war for a few stolen hours. Outside, the world burned. Inside, Escobar surrendered to his obsession. And this, too, became part of his downfall. Because while Escobar was distracted by women, his enemies moved. Every secret rendezvous, every hidden affair, became an opportunity. Police learned of addresses through gossip. Rivals tracked his movements through whispers of women he had visited. Even within his own organization, some questioned his judgment. Was the great Pablo Escobar, the feared, really risking everything for the fleeting comfort of a mistress's bed? The answer was yes. Again and again he did. And in this way his mistresses were not only lovers, but liabilities. Some betrayed him knowingly. Others betrayed him simply by existing, by being another secret too heavy to carry. What Escobar never understood or perhaps never cared to understand, was that power and desire cannot coexist forever. A man who rules by fear cannot also expect loyalty and love. And a man who builds an empire on violence cannot keep passion pure. His mistresses saw the truth of him, not the not the family man holding his daughter's hand. They saw the predator. They saw the vulnerability. And some of them, quietly, carried those truths to the outside world. In the end, Escobar was not only destroyed by bullets and betrayal among his men, he was destroyed too by the weight of his own indulgence. The women who loved him, hated him, and whispered his secrets into the night. And that, perhaps, is the most scandalous truth of all. That even the greatest drug lord in history, with his armies and his millions, could not protect himself from the whispers of his own mistresses. By the early 1990s, Pablo Escobar's empire was collapsing. The cartel, once untouchable, was bleeding. Rivals from the Cali cartel struck deals with the government. Americans pressed harder than ever. His trusted men were killed, arrested, or turned against him. And still, even as his power crumbled brick by brick, Escobar clung to the pleasures that had defined his private life. It is said that in those last years, his obsession with mistresses only deepened. Perhaps it was escape, a way to forget the noose tightening around his neck. Perhaps it was habit, a hunger that would not let go, even when survival demanded discipline. Whatever the reason, Escobar could not abandon desire. The contrast was surreal. On one hand, he was a fugitive, hiding in apartments, moving between safe houses, his empire shrinking day by day. On the other, he still found ways to surround himself with women. His men, even in the middle of war, were tasked with finding new lovers, arranging secret meetings, keeping the fantasy alive. Some of these women knew the danger. Others did not fully understand. They were told only that they would meet a powerful man, a man who could change their lives with a single gesture. They were lured with promises of money, gifts, protection. And when they stepped into the dim rooms where Escobar waited, they found not a king on a throne, but a hunted man who still demanded to be worshipped. The atmosphere was tense. Guards stood outside. Windows were covered with thick curtains. Guns leaned against the walls. And in the middle of this, Escobar would pour a glass of wine, smile, and invite his mistress closer, as if the world outside no longer existed. But the world outside did exist, and it was closing in. Every rendezvous carried risk. Each mistress was another potential leak. The police, the search block, even the Cali cartel, all knew that Escobar's weakness was women. They listened for rumors, followed whispers, traced movements. If he went to see a mistress, it meant exposure. If she spoke carelessly, it meant danger. One story tells of Escobar slipping into a modest apartment and to visit a young mistress. He stayed for hours, lost in her company. But while he was there, neighbors noticed the unusual movement of cars, the quiet presence of armed men. Someone spoke. The next day, the police raided the neighborhood. Escobar had already vanished, but the message was clear. His pleasures were costing him his safety. His wife, Maria Victoria, remained silent. By then, she knew her husband's infidelity was endless, and her only concern was protecting their children. She lived like a shadow, raising them in fear, moving constantly, shielding them from the chaos. For her, the mistresses were no longer rivals in love. They were simply reminders of a life lived in betrayal. For Escobar's mistresses, the fear grew too. To be close to him was once a symbol of power, a badge of luxury. Now it was a death sentence waiting to fall. The police hunted him. His enemies hunted him. Anyone near him became a target, yet some still stayed, caught in his charm, addicted to the rush of being with the most dangerous man alive. As the walls closed in, Escobar grew more reckless. He spent less time with his cartel, less time with strategy, and more time clinging to his pleasures. He would make phone calls from safe houses, not to discuss shipments, but to summon a mistress. He would risk exposure, knowing the police were tracking his calls, just to hear the voice of a woman he desired. It was obsession at its purest, and its most destructive. And yet, within these final indulgences, a strange humanity appeared. Some mistresses described him not as the violent, but as a man suddenly fragile. He laughed less. He smoked more. His eyes, once filled with fire, seemed haunted. He spoke of the future rarely, because he knew there was none. Still, he touched their hands. He whispered their names. He asked for comfort, as if in their embrace he could forget the empire slipping away. It is here that Escobar's mistresses reveal their deepest paradox. They were not only symbols of his power, but also witnesses to his fear. They saw him not as Colombia's untouchable drug lord, but as a man trembling in the dark, hunted, desperate for warmth. This duality, predator and prey, king and fugitive, was the final scandal of Escobar's private life. He had built his identity on control, on the idea that nothing was beyond his reach. And yet, in those last months, the women who lay beside him saw the truth, that even the most feared man in the world could not escape his own fragility. One mistress later told a friend that Escobar would sometimes fall asleep in her arms, murmuring his daughter's name, as if clinging to a memory of innocence. It was a heartbreaking glimpse into a man who had destroyed so many lives, and yet longed, in his final days, for the purity he could never reclaim. But sentiment could not save him. His indulgence, his recklessness, his need for women, all of it helped lead the hunters to his door. Every visit, every whispered meeting, every careless call chipped away at his defenses. And so, as December 1993 approached, Escobar's mistresses were no longer just pleasures. They were cracks in the armor. They were silent witnesses to his downfall. The empire of cocaine had already begun to rot. The empire of women would soon collapse with it. By December 1993, Pablo Escobar was a man running out of time. Cartel was broken, his allies dead or surrendered, his fortune scattered. His enemies, once distant shadows, now pressed at every door. Yet even as the walls tightened, Escobar clung to one dangerous ritual: the need to hear the voices of those he loved and those he desired. It was not business calls that betrayed him in those final days. It was not strategy, not plans. It was the quiet calls to his family and to his mistresses. The search block, working with U.S. intelligence, tracked him through radio triangulation. Every time he picked up a phone, every time his voice touched the line, it was another breadcrumb leading them closer. And Escobar could not resist. He called his daughter Manuela. He called his wife. He called women who waited for him in silence, their lives tethered to the most hunted man in the world. Some mistresses were terrified to answer. They knew the risk. Single conversation could mean death for both of them. Others, still enchanted, still loyal, picked up the phone anyway, their voices trembling, their hearts racing, knowing that behind the line was a ghost. It is said that Escobar's last calls were strangely tender. He spoke not as the butt, as a weary lover, as a father, as a man too tired to fight. He asked about meals, about dreams, about memories, and in between those soft words he asked for reassurance, for the sound of a voice that reminded him he was still alive. But every word was a dagger pointed back at him. On December 2nd, 1993, Escobar made one call too many. It was to his son, Juan Pablo. The conversation was short, but long enough. Colombian intelligence captured the signal. Search block moved in. Escobar, restless, stepped out onto the rooftop of his hideout. He was barefoot, his shirt unbuttoned, the world collapsing around him. He tried to run, leaping across the red-tiled roofs of Butte. The hunters were there. A bullet struck him. His body fell heavy on the tiles, lifeless, blood seeping into the city he once ruled. The world called it justice. His enemies called it victory. His family called it tragedy. And his mistresses, those silent figures in the shadows of his empire, felt the tremor in their own lives. For them, Escobar's death meant freedom and fear in equal measure. Some fled the city, vanishing into anonymity. Others were questioned, their names whispered, their secrets dangerous to tell. A few clung to the memories, torn between horror and longing, remembering the man who had once held them in the glow of forbidden nights. In the scandalous fabric of Escobar's legacy, his mistresses remained threads, often ignored, yet vital. They were not queens, not rulers, not generals, but they were witnesses to his indulgence, to his obsession, to his downfall. They saw the contradictions of the man more clearly than anyone. To the world, he was the untouchable narco king. To them, he was a restless shadow, craving tenderness while drowning in blood. And so, the story closes where it began, with desire, with scandal, with power slipping through desperate hands. Escobar's empire of cocaine may have shattered in gunfire, but his empire of women, fragile and hidden, left behind its own haunting legacy, a legacy of passion entwined with violence, a legacy of mistresses who lived like ghosts, a legacy that reminds us that even the most feared man of his age was undone, not just by bullets, but by his own need for love. So tonight, as we let this story settle, we step back into silence. The rooftops of R are quiet now. The women who once whispered Escobar's name are scattered, their voices lost to history. But the scandal remains, carried like smoke through the corridors of memory. And perhaps the moral lingers too. That power built on fear cannot last, that indulgence can become a cage. And that even kings or drug lords are brought down not by armies, alone, but by the fragile, dangerous, undeniable pull of human desire.